Now I'd like to discuss basically material and equipment in the context of a market-based defense system. Uh, one of the, and I'm doing this because one of the objections you're going to hear a lot of the time is that uh, it's impractical for defense to be handled by anything other than the state because only the state can uh, afford to build and maintain the necessary equipment. Now, there's two problems with this. One is that it assumes that uh, market conditions must ape a state. So if the state builds aircraft carriers and nuclear submarines and whatever, that if free markets don't do that, then they are necessarily inferior. And this this is pretty fallacious for a couple of reasons. One, most countries today don't have aircraft carriers and nuclear power, and that does not mean that they are helpless and always being attacked. So to allege that defense is not possible without these items is to say that every country on earth practically is defenseless with the exception of the United States. So that's silly. The second, it's false to think that the market should ape the state. It's quite conceivable that the state has misallocated resources, and this isn't just true of defense or military. This is true basically everything it does. Uh, it would be just as it's akin to saying that the government knows exactly how many roads we should have, and the number of roads that we have is exactly correct, and their routes and where they go are all exactly where they should be. And if the market so much as closed a single road or built one that isn't there today, then it's a market failure. And that's just absurd. And the idea that the market must build this or that, and you need you need a better argument for that other than the state does that currently. Now the second part is that just because the state does do it, it doesn't mean that it can't be done if it's necessary through the market. And usually, if you look, most of the military equipment that the states do use, at least in the United States, are actually built by private firms. Now it's true that it's paid for with tax money. The state is paying and it's using tax money. But if the demand was there, then the money would be there anyway. If there's a demand for a good, then and it's possible to be built, then there's a profit incentive to build it. And these aircraft carriers, all the nuclear weapons in the United States are built by Raytheon and Westinghouse, and it's not some government factory that's completely run by the state, or it's for profit entities, just like Patriot missiles and all the fighter jets and everything else. And so and I think where this comes from is people, when you talk about a free market, they imagine our current citizenry just absent the government. What they fail to realize is that absent the government, the citizenry would be different. So for instance, they'll allege that, well, you can't hope to have adequate defense without the government, because then you'd only have rifles and handguns versus all manner of military equipment. And this is fallacious because there's no reason to just assume that that would be the only thing available. If people think they need tanks and anti-aircraft missiles or aircraft or nuclear submarines or whatever, on a free market, there's nothing that prevents them from obtaining them, or at least attempting to attain them, or attempting to obtain something that has the same effect. So right now, it's illegal to own, things bigger than rifles in most of the cases. I mean, it is legal to own tanks if they're not functional and you jump through a lot of hoops. But it's perfectly reasonable to assume that in the United States, where there are no restrictions, that there could easily be tens of thousands of tanks in private hands. There are lots of people who just like them for hobbies. People have built them themselves. Just look up Marv Heemeyer and the Killdozer. That was a guy who got pissed off at his local government, and he basically constructed his own tank out of a bulldozer that all the government in his town was helpless to stop, and he demolished the police station and the city hall and everything before he killed himself. And it's perfectly reasonable to assume that there would be many thousands of tanks in the United States in private hands, and then their distribution would be impossible to determine. There'd be no secret database that would have their location and their characteristics and their capabilities all lined up, which, by the way, is a failing of our military that we know, that I know personally on at least one occasion, that the whereabouts of the entire Navy, for instance, were betrayed to the Soviets. I mean, here we have, we're always told, well, we got to have a military, but the Navy had a disgruntled officer who decided to make a couple extra bucks, and he basically gave the Soviets the codes that the Navy used to communicate, and for like 15 or 20 years, the Soviets were able to know the location of basically every single vessel in the United States Navy, including the nuclear submarines. That's something that's not possible if you don't have a centralized defense organization. Anyway, that's a little tangential, but the idea that there would be limits to what you could buy, I actually personally do not think that the big things like aircraft carriers, I don't think that the market would actually invest in those, because I actually think they're just huge wastes of money. They're not good for defense. They're pretty much only good for offense. They are powerful. There's no question that they are powerful. But they also cost hundreds of billions of dollars, and they almost never get used. I remember watching PBS, or Mel Gibson or somebody made a documentary about one of the super, I think it was the Nimitz, one of the Nimitz class aircraft carriers, and you know, it sailed into the Persian Gulf for a couple months and then came back. Well, the whole thing cost hundreds of billions of dollars. The whole time they didn't even drop one bomb, and even if they had, the whole thing was in the Persian Gulf fighting a non-defensive war. So we as taxpayers paid a lot of money for that, for nothing. And that was just one mission, and there's always a couple of those out all the time. So it's incorrect to assume that the market should ape the government, and this goes for anything, not just the military and defense. But even if it had to, even if it was really necessary, since the funds that, since the wealth that creates and maintains those goods, those materials, come from society, it's erroneous to assume that they would be impossible absent the state. You know, the state isn't a magical lens that increases wealth. It actually wastes wealth just by the redistribution. You know, the hundreds of billions of dollars they spent on that aircraft carrier, they taxed billions more and lost a lot of it in just the friction of bureaucracy. And so it doesn't magically make something possible that wasn't possible before. It just makes something wasteful that maybe wasn't necessarily wasteful before, or as wasteful anyway. So I think it's important to bear in mind that it's not the duty of the market to mimic or imitate the state. We shouldn't expect it to do that. We shouldn't even want it to do that. And we should always point out that it's unnecessary.